Our next question, Jim, was sent in via email to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Steve Van Etten. So, I was only a toddler during the mid-1980s Jim Crockett Promotions glory days, so forgive my ignorance, but did people actually think Gorgeous Jimmy and Ron Garvin were brothers? How much did they actually try to sell that, considering they look nothing alike and have completely different accents?
Well, how can I convey this? Nobody actually ever questioned whether they were brothers or not. They thought they were brothers because they'd been billed as brothers so long, even though they weren't really brothers. So at that point, you would have had a harder time talking the average fan in the building into believing that they weren't brothers than that they were. Did I say that right?
Yeah, I mean, plus, even though it's the 1980s and there were kids like this person who sent the question, and Steve, there were people who were there in the 70s who may remember a young Jimmy Garvin with Ron Garvin and Terry Garvin. So there was that history. You couldn't ignore that there was something there, that there was a family relationship there.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, that's why that some of the boys in the locker room actually kind of looked sideways, like, why the fuck, when Ronnie was there first and they brought Jimmy in, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
When Jimmy came in and it's like, this is not good because people think they're brothers, but one's a heel and one's a baby face. That wasn't good. Because, and they couldn't do a program against each other, obviously, because people wouldn't buy that. That's why the brother thing was always touchy. In Tennessee for a while in 75-ish, Don Green had switched babyface because he was working for Nick basically on the Nashville Birmingham end, and he was a babyface, and people liked Don as a babyface as a single, but Don and Al Green as brothers had been one of the hottest heel teams for the previous 15 years, the Mean Greens, the original Heavenly Bodies, and Al was on the Jarrett end, working as a manager. No, I tell a lie. He's ended up working it, but he was on the Jarrett end, just working underneath. And before that, Jarrett split off from Goulas. Sometimes the two rosters met in the middle in Louisville. There was guys from the Birmingham end and guys from fucking Memphis end in 75. So we actually had a couple of times where there was a 6 or 8 man tag where Don Green was a babyface on one side and Al Green was a heel on the other side. And they wouldn't get in the ring with each other. And then there was also a period of time where Don Green was Mr. Wrestling under a mask, and the same thing happened, and they'd make sure to not ever have, because you couldn't really hide Don Green's hairy body. He looked like Lawler with all that body hair, right? So they would make sure not to get in against each other. So finally, even though Gorgeous Jimmy was a great heel and everybody respected Ronnie, and if they didn't, he'd beat the fuck out of him, so nobody said anything. There's some guys were happy when they reunited them, when they switched Jimmy babyface, when we did the deal where I burned Ronnie, because at least that way that tied up a fucking kayfabe violation. One brother is a fucking heel and the other one's a babyface. Are we expected to believe they're not speaking? Do they go to each other's house at Christmas? If that's the case, then why can't fucking Ronnie talk Jimmy into not fucking helping the Horseman fuck with Dusty? That's what people thought about in the 70s and 80s. Am I right? Yeah. You would get those letters all the time from the fans.
That's one of the reasons that the angle when you burned Ronnie Garvin was so impactful after the burn. When you guys are in the locker room and all of a sudden Jimmy Garvin finds out that his brother, who they've had no interaction whatsoever on TV, finds out his brother's been burned. You know, one's a heel, one's a babyface. He turns into his brother right there, and he goes right for you.
Did I ever tell you the Bubba Ray Dudley story?
I don't know.
Well, Bubba Ray was down here at OVW in like 2005, right? And we're telling stories, and we were talking, and I mentioned that angle, and I said what made it was, I said, after I've set fire to Garvin's face, right, and all the baby faces hit the ring, and the Midnight Express, we take off, and we're laughing. From the heel locker room comes, through the people at Charlotte Coliseum, comes Jimmy Garvin with Precious, and Jimmy's fucking shoving people away, and he's distraught, and he's looking at his brother's been set on fire, and then he looks back at where the direction of the heel locker room, and he jumps out of the ring, and he takes off, and the camera's following him down the aisleway. And the fucking basically I tell a lie. He went through. They got them. He took off with Ronnie, right? And they got Ronnie back in the babyface locker room. And that's when he looks over at the heel locker room, the direction that you know it is, and he fucking takes off.
Yeah.
And he kicks in the fucking door of the heel locker room, and there I'm sitting, and I knew he was coming, right? And the instruction that I got was cover the fuck up. Because it's got to look like he's going to fucking kill you. And the camera did not do it justice. Because everybody piled on top because the boys knew he's going to beat shit out of me if they didn't pull him off, right? And it's in front of all the heels, so all the heels swarm on fucking Jimmy Garvin. I'm screaming, get him off me, get him off me. But when he kicked in that door and went in the heel locker room, he was so blah, blah, blah. And then as they throw him out of the fucking heel locker room, he runs. Precious has pulled up the car. They put Ronnie in the fucking car with the towel over his head and in the back seat and take him to the fucking hospital. And that's the end of the fucking show. And I was telling that story, and Bubba Ray said, oh, wait a minute. Apparently they had done the same thing in ECW, and he thought Paul Lee thought of it for the fucking guy that's switching to run from the babyface locker room and kick the door into the heel locker room. I can't remember who they did it with, right? But I thought Paul came up with that. I said, not unless he came up with it and called it into Dusty in 1987. But that's what made it, because then once, I had thought because I saw Ron Garvin and his brother Terry Garvin with manager Jim Garvin in 1973 on television here in Louisville. And then I met Jimmy Garvin in 1977 when he came back. I didn't know it was the same guy, because Jimmy, when he was 18 in 1973, had the fucking bleach blonde hair and was about 170 pounds, maybe, and skinny, and was the fucking manager. And then in 1977, Jimmy Garvin comes in with dark curly hair and fucking weighing 210 or whatever, and a mustache. And I'm like, what the fuck? I asked him, I said, you're same Jimmy guy. Yeah, it's me. And then I met Ronnie in 78 in Knoxville. And I never met Terry Garvin in my life. Imagine that.
I always thought it was weird that obviously the Garvin brothers first start teaming up in Canada, even though they're not really brothers. Terry Garvin and Ron Garvin are not brothers. And then eventually Jimmy, who's Ron's stepson, right?
Yes.
He joins the team, but then Ronnie leaves the team and the stepson stays with Terry Garvin on the road.
Yes. Because Jimmy was getting experience, I think, at that time. Where did Ronnie go? I'm trying to remember. I think he had a spot somewhere. Basically, sure, yeah. Jimmy wanted to get in the wrestling business, and when he turned 18, Ronnie agreed to take him on the road and try to teach him the business, because that's how he became the manager. And when he gained enough weight and got to enough size to where it wasn't embarrassing back then that the guy would be a wrestler, then he already knew the business and was allowed to start wrestling for a period of time. And once again, if you want to learn, you team with a veteran. It was Terry and Jim Garvin, because I think Ronnie was, of the three of them at that point, was the worker and the name and the guy of the three of them, the main talent. So I think he got, for a while, a spot somewhere else and took that.
When you started seeing them in 73, were they already using the pink mat?
And you know what? I remember it briefly, but I don't know that they did it a ton. I never get to see them live in Louisville, because that was before I got started going to the Gardens, and my television was black and white at that point. But it wasn't like that they just put a brand new canvas on the ring. They rolled out a pink, rug, basically. Yeah, but I don't think they did that everywhere here at that point in time. But I do remember one of the greatest. This is probably the first memory I have of Luthez, because it was so shocking at the time, and you could buy it. Obviously, Ron Garvin and Terry Garvin were both bleach blonde, but Ron wore trunks and boots and did not act effeminate, whereas Terry wore the frilly robes and had the gorgeous George hairdo. And he, pretty much went the whole way with the gimmick, which wasn't a gimmick in real life. But at that point, nobody knew, what was a gimmick and what wasn't. They just, Terry Garvin, that fucking no good, blah, blah, blah.
His wife didn't know.
But there you go. Jimmy was this little teenage bleach blonde kid, so he could work for either one, right? He's the heat getting manager just to distract and hand in gimmicks. But anyway, they did an angle, and I'm pretty sure I want to say it was Sterling Brewer was the announcer, which meant it was probably the Birmingham television taping. But nevertheless, on one of Nick's TVs, Thez was in as a babyface. And I want to say I can't even remember who his partner was. Fuck, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of this equation. They have a TV match, and some way or another, Thez gets knocked out of the ring through the ropes and gets his leg, like his ankle, his wrestling boot, caught in the bottom rope and the middle rope, and he's hanging out with his head on the floor, right? So he's upside down and completely helpless. He's taken this fall through the ropes, and now he's trapped, he's hung, and Terry Garvin in that fucking robe and all that shit comes over and starts kicking Thez in the ass. I don't even know whether he told him he was going to do it ahead of time or whether he even realized what he was doing, but that was the thing that was exposed because Thez's face was facing into the ring. Garvin couldn't. He didn't want to kick him in the head. He wanted to kick him where the fuck the camera would see it. So the back and the ass was all it, right? So he's kicking him in the back and the ass. And Thez is struggling, like he's trying to get out. And finally the baby faces run him out, and they go to the break, and they come back, and there is Thez, and he's pissed. And I'm 11, right? And I've heard from the announcers that Lou Thez is a 6-time world champion, greatest wrestler of all time. But I haven't heard a lot of his promos. He's fucking hot. He's fired up. And you don't usually think of Lou Thez that way, right? He was always the gentleman and the sportsman. No, and I can't say the line that made it so fucking memorable that 46 years later, I can still remember it. But Lou Thez standing there, and now with what I know about the man, who didn't even like to be on shows where they had midgets and girls on the card, and definitely wouldn't appear with the wrestling bear, and tried to present himself as a legitimate professional athlete, and was a legitimate hooker and fucking shooter, and the image that he tried to portray all through he had been in the business at that point for 38 fucking years. And now he's on TV in Birmingham in a studio with Terry Garvin in a frilly robe and a gorgeous George hair kicking him in the ass. And he just said, I'll be damned if I'm going to let some F word kick me in the butt on television. And they played it, right? And the people go crazy. Holy shit. They're really mad. And I remember that 46 years was 1973. 46 years later, I remember it because he was really fucking mad. But they drew money off that angle, by the way, for a while. The fucking Terry Garvin, while he was tied up in the ropes, kicked him in the ass. Oh. Now they would have used a fucking chainsaw, shoved it up his ass. The fucking blood would have spurted everywhere, and he'd be back in the next segment doing a comedy skit with a charity patient.
And then he would tweet him, great job tonight.
Yeah, great job tonight with that chainsaw, Ralph.